Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim Daf Ayin Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Hannah Hassan for Refuah Shlema of Rhonda Cohen, Rachel Devora Bat Elka. Today's daf is sponsored by Eli Schultz Sharp in honor of her daughter Elisheva Mazal Sharp for being her Daf Yomi partner for the last 3 years. Sheva, you inspired me to get started and continue to inspire me. Abba and I are so proud of you. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. I'm going to review a little bit of what we did yesterday. I know these vachomers are complicated. And I'm going to also share my screen. 1 second. And going to, wait a minute. Okay, let's make sure this is set up. So our topic that we were dealing with as soon as we got through the Mishnah was a discussion of, okay, there we go. A discussion of, we had a machlok of Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis in the Mishnah on Daf Ayin Hey, which was if a man says to his wife in advance, I want to get rid of all your vows, any vow you make. Can he do that or not? Rabbi Eliezer said very simply, of course he could do it. If the vow was already made, then all the more so, vachomer, right? And he can get rid of that. All the more so, he can get rid of future vows. And then the Gemara wanted to, right, because they're weaker, so they haven't even happened yet. Of course, you should be able to prevent them from happening. So now the big question becomes, well, get rid of them or prevent them from happening. What's the right language? What did Rabbi Eliezer mean when he said? And in order to get to an answer for that, they quote, number one, they quoted our Mishnah, and then they quoted the Tosefta, which had a much more elaborate or more kal vachomer arguments made between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer with his kal vachomers, and the rabbis with their knockouts of the kal vachomer, okay, right? Even very simply, you could see here, X, V, right? X check, 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 right? If this is not, and yet this is, then that is, and of course that should also be yes. And it's right. And that was his attempt to prove it. And then the rabbi said, without getting into all the details, right? But when it comes to a mikvah, or maybe we'll just review the mikvah case, if an object, right? We're taking all sorts of examples, the vow not being made and an item not yet being impure. Okay, that's going to be our basic comparison for the most part, which is if it's not yet impure, it's obviously easier to get rid of impurity, right? And prevent impurity from happening. And what we're going to do, again, there's number one, there's the logic of their argument, which we're going to go through again. But the key, and the reason why the Gemara is bringing all this is to derive from the wording, does this show it will take effect or does it show it will not take effect? So we ended yesterday with our third attempt to prove with this mikvah, comparing a mikvah to a person and saying a mikvah, if the object was already impure, you could put in the mikveh and purify it. And if the object was not yet impure, then you can't protect it from becoming impure. But yet, if you were going to take your kal vachomer, it would say then a person who, if the object was already impure and he goes in the mikveh with this in his, right, that he swallowed, after class, some people pointed out, right, it seems like he even swallowed it, not just it was in his mouth, but he swallowed it. When that ring comes out of his body, right, it's not going to be pure because the person went in the mikvah. And therefore, what would you say? Your logic would state that if the object wasn't yet impure, then of course he can't protect it, right? And that's a case where he goes into a house which has a dead body, he becomes impure, and yet the object is protected. So you see here the kal vachomer logic doesn't work. To which the Gemara says, again, the key reason the Gemara brought this was to say, the language is, shouldn't it be protective from becoming impure? And likewise in the mikvah, the object, right, the mikvah should be able to prevent it from becoming impure, and it doesn't, right? Anyway, the point being, the language is clearly protected from ever having impurity come upon it, which means that it doesn't take effect at all. It's not like it takes effect and then disappears. That's what we're up to right now. So the Gemara in the next section starts with a retort and says, no, you can't prove from that Tosefta because the next line in the Tosefta, okay, you can already see on the chart, is going to give us an indication that it will take effect from the language in the next part. The next part is the rabbi's second argument against Rabbi Eliezer. Ema Seifa, they say to him, okay, so now the Gemara is saying, look at the second part. Amru lo Rabbi Eliezer. They said to Rabbi Eliezer the following. Im matbilim kli tamei litahel, if you can take a pure vessel, an impure vessel, And right now we're focusing not on what the mikveh has the powers to do, but the vessel itself. If you take a vessel that was already impure and you put it in the mikveh, obviously you purify it. That's how you do it. But right here's according to your logic. Now, what is Rabbi Eliezer's logic? Rabbi Eliezer's logic is if it's already impure, it's already right much stronger. Obviously, it should work when it's less strong. So it's the same kind of idea as before, but again, the language is going to be different, which is why we're going to infer the exact opposite, that it will take effect and not that it won't take effect. And they're just focusing instead of on the power of the mikvah, the ability of the vessel itself to become pure. So yatbilu kli, you should be able to, if it's already impure, and just like your vow, it's already there, he could be made fair. And Rabbi Eliezer, you said that means that, of course, before it even happens, he should be able to prevent it from happening. Likewise here, yadbilu kli l'chashiyitma litaher. Your logic would state that one could put a kli in a mikvah in order to, now what's the in order to? Not to prevent it from becoming impure, the language we used before in their previous statement, but l'chashiyitma litaher. It should work that when it were to become impure, it would be immediately purified. So basically, which is of course not the case, but what the rabbis are saying is that's where your logic would take us. So again, there's the argument of the rabbis, but that doesn't really interest us right now. What interests us is the language. So the language of the first line of the rabbis was very clear. It will prevent it from taking effect. The language in this part is saying it will take effect, the impurity, but it will be immediately, right? Instead of saying that the mikvah provides this shield, right, that it protects whatever you put in the mikvah and impurity will never get to it, this is saying the opposite. Well, not the opposite, but the opposite in terms of our question. When you put a kli in the mikvah, a vessel in the mikvah, what will happen? When it wanders on the street and somebody touches it, yes, the impurity will come on, but the water from before will make it magically disappear. Okay? So we now have two different statements of the rabbis. They're both with the same agenda, but the language in terms of the answer to our question, what did Rabbi Eliezer think? Now, again, what's the tricky part here? We're quoting the rabbi's response to Rabbi Eliezer and not Rabbi Eliezer himself, and we're trying to infer from there what Rabbi Eliezer actually holds. And that's going to be the problem here. The Gemara is going to say now, so first the Gemara is going to say Shema Mina Chayilin. Right? So it should be inferred from here that it will take effect. So now the Gemara says, moving on to the next chart on our page here, Amre Rabbana lo kaime lahom b'tamid de Rabbi Eliezer. The truth is, okay, in order to say how do we deal with this, because we thought it came as a proof, but now it could prove both. Well, the truth is the rabbis didn't really know what Rabbi Eliezer held about this. In other words, the rabbis had the same question we have, which is, did Rabbi Eliezer mean it doesn't take effect at all? Or did Rabbi Eliezer mean it will take effect, but immediately be dissolved? So what they do, because they weren't sure. So they said, this is what they said to you. My spheralach, we don't know what you hold, right? What do you hold? If you think that the neder, the vow will take effect and then be dissolved, well, nullified, well, then I'll give you a case of the vessel to prove. And basically the language of the vessel says, well, there you see, even if it were to take effect, right? If it were to take effect, there's no way it would work to purify it. So therefore the same thing with your vow. And and if you don't say that it takes effect and you think the nullification will happen, it will prevent the neder from actually taking effect, then we'll use the mikvah, which was talking about preventing impurity from taking effect at all. So basically the reason why one language sounded like this and one language sounded like that was because the rabbis weren't sure, and that's why they brought two different arguments to say, if you hold this way, that way, if you hold that way, and done with it. So option number 3 to explain in answer, does it take effect? Does it not take effect? Was totally ineffective. So now we move on. But now we're going to actually have a fourth source. And from that fourth source, we're actually going to get to an answer. Tashma. Let's learn from here. A bright. Amar lahem Rabbi Eliezer. Another, right? We have all these vachomer arguments that Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis keep saying to each other. Right? The rabbis were kind of undoing the vachomer arguments, and Rabbi Eliezer kept making them. So Rabbi Eliezer says to them, Uma zra'im tme'im, kevan shezara'am b'karka torim. If you plant a seed in the ground and it happens to be an impure seed, what happens when you plant it in the ground? The Truma leaves it, basically. What grows is new and it's not impure. So that's something that's already impure. And when you plant it, it becomes pure. In the same way, and this actually does work, seeds that were already planted, if impurity gets onto them, right, they'll remain pure. Remember the whole thing about susceptible to impurity? It can't be anything attached to the ground. So anything growing also. So now they say like this. Now the rabbis actually don't disagree. They just say that both of these are learned from the pasuk. But Rabbi Eliezer claims that only the first one is learned from the pasuk, that if you plant something, it basically takes out the impurity, and that the seeds that were already planted are learned by vachomer. So what does he say? Here you have a vachomer about, obviously, right? Again, it's the same idea. When it's already there, it's obviously much harder, and yet it becomes pure. So all the more so when it hasn't even, right? They were already planted, right? And the point of already being planted means they were pure to begin with. They were not even yet impure. Of course, they're going to remain pure. Now, what's the point though for our purposes? This is a case of, the point is they remain pure. They never become impure and are protected from, right? And then immediately poof, the impurity leaves it. No, they never become impure at all, not even for a second. So this proves Shmamina lo chaylin. Since his proof here, which doesn't get changed or anything else, is to compare to the seeds never become impure at all. And therefore we learn in the end, lo chaylin. Hey, we're done with that section, although we have one more vachomer to go, but we're done with all those attempts to try to prove that, that what does Rabbi Eliezer hold? Does it take effect? Does it not? In the end, we prove that when he says, when a husband gets up and says, any neder you take from here on in will be null and void, the neder doesn't even take effect at all. Now we're going to have le Rabbanan, who disagree with him, lo darshe vachomer. It seemed pretty clear they don't hold by vachomers. They kept saying, your vachomer makes no sense, right? I can knock it out like this. I can knock it out like that. So how could it be, though, that they don't hold by this kind of vachomer? We're going to bring another case where we have something, again, that's harder to do and something that's easier to do because it's not yet happened yet. And the rabbis are going to hold the vachomer just like Rabbi Eliezer. So now we're going to have a problem. If they hold vachomer just like Rabbi Eliezer, why don't they hold it in our case? V'ha'atanya, as it says, doesn't it say in a Braita, Yachol yimkor adam et bito kshinara. This is a halacha about man is allowed to sell his young daughter into slavery when she's a minor, when she's a ketana. The question is, can he sell her when she's a na'ara? Now, what normally happens is when she becomes the age of a na'ara, she gets set free unless she gets married off to the man she's sold to slavery to or to his son. Okay, it's hard for us to imagine in our day and age, and I don't have time to go into it today, but that's a whole topic in and of itself. Anyway, we'll just accept it for right now, and we'll deal with it when we get to a sugya that's kind of more head-on into this. So you might think, Yimkor adam et bito kshinara. What's the end date that you could sell your daughter into slavery, right? People would do this, by the way, because they had no money, right? People sold themselves to be slaves to people, right? Eved ivri. This is a ma'ivriya. So it has all its halachot associated with it. And again, like ways to protect, the same way there's ways to protect the slaves from being taken advantage of, there's ways to protect this woman also from being taken advantage of, but still it is a form of, servitude, I would say, rather than slavery. So, can he sell his daughter to be a servant when she is in that in-between stage? Remember, age 12, she has 2 pubic hairs for 6 months. Amarta kavachomer. Now here come the rabbis, and they say, oh, it's kavachomer. Michura kvar yotza. If she's already sold, she gets to go free, right? In other words, she was sold when she was a minor. This is the left side of the chart, right? She will be freed when she becomes a na'ara, right? So basically, X, because she won't be a slave anymore. Eina michura, but if she's not sold yet, eino din shaloti machel. Shouldn't it be obvious that she can't be sold, right? In other words, if you're going to get free when you're already a slave, right, again, which is much harder to free, of course, if you're not yet sold, you cannot be sold into slavery. So here, again, it's the same thing. If you have the option, right, to nullify something, all the more so, right, would you have the ability to prevent it. And that's the exact same vachomer we've been making, that Rabbi Eliezer has been making all along. And here the rabbis make it. So how could that possibly be? To which we now move to Amud Bet. The Gemara says, the truth is, they actually hold by this vachomer. In other words, this logic, they would have agreed with Rabbi Eliezer about his logic, which is interesting because in the Tosefta, they knock out his logic. But you could claim that that's just a method of argumentation. But really, why did they disagree with him if they actually hold by his vachomer? Remember, his basic vachomer, without getting into all the complicated ones, is if he can undo the vow when it's existing, obviously he can prevent it from even coming into fruition. So the Gemara says, Shanehacha, what's the reason? And this was already in the Mishnah. Because the pasuk says her husband will ratify the vow and her husband can nullify the vow. If you remember, there was a whole, everyone agreed in the Mishnah that you can't ratify something that doesn't exist yet. So all the more so, right, if Hakam and Hafer are mentioned right next to each other in the pasuk, what's true for one is true for the other. In simpler language, you can give me any vachomer you want, the rabbis say, and I agree that these vachomers make sense, but in the end, it's what we call gzerat hakatuv. The Torah said it, and it's the way they read the psukim, because it puts ratification and nullification next to each other. It must mean that what's true for one is true for the other, which means nullification can only work when ratification can work. And there's no ratifying a vow that never happened, and therefore there's definitely no nullifying. So while the vachomer logic could theoretically work according to the rabbis, it doesn't work because of a separate reason. And this often happens where logical arguments often get overridden by Torah proofs. If it says so in the Torah, well, there's nothing to do about it. Okay, new Mishnah. This is a much simpler section. Mishnah, Hafarat Nedarim Kol Hayom. This is something we've been talking about, but we never really got to define. A classic halachic argument, when it says on the day he hears, what is the limit of day? Okay, right? We can come up with multiple interpretations. It could mean till sunset. It could mean till tzedek kochavim. Okay, in this case, we're not going to get into the differences between sunset and when the 3 stars come out, and they don't seem to talk about that. They just call it the end of the halachic day, because the halachic day starts at night. Could be midnight. Could be till the morning, right? Either when the sun rises or maybe the time period before that, alot hashachar. Okay, it could be all sorts of things. It could be 24 hours, right? What does it mean, day? So the Mishnah is going to only give us one opinion, but then the Gemara is going to immediately quote a Braita with 2 opinions. Okay, even though, as I said, there could be multiple opinions here. Hafarat nedarim kol hayom. You can nullify the vows all day. Yesh b'davar lahakel ulahachmir. This has kula, a leniency, and a stringency. Okay, now the Ran says, you're going to see in a minute, this doesn't mean leniency and stringency, like a halachic leniency and stringency. What it means is you could have it a very long, right, a very large possibility, which is really the lenient, right? You could have a lot of hours, and you could potentially have very few hours. Okay, and this doesn't mean the halachic kula vachomer here. Ketzah, what would be the example? Or 2 examples that you can see the difference, lahakel and lahachmil. Nadra b'leilei Shabbat. Let's say Shabbat comes in, and okay, why are they specifically talking about Shabbat? It could be any day of the week. The Gemara is going to later infer, mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat. This teaches you can even nullify vows on Shabbos, which you might have thought not. Anyway, we'll get to that sugya later. It's the first sugya of tomorrow's daf. Ketzad. So nadra b'leilei Shabbat. It's Friday night. Shabbat's already come in. She takes a vow. Yafir b'leilei Shabbat ubiyom Shabbat ad shetachshach. She has, basically, it could be 23 hours, 24 hours. She has till it gets dark. Okay, it doesn't tell you what dark means. Is it? Okay, we've seen that halachic, differences in different places, but we're not going to get into that now. But basically, she has till nightfall the next day. So he has the opportunity to nullify this vow up until the next day, because it started right at the beginning of the day, the halachic day. Nadrat im chashecha. But if she took a vow on Shabbat afternoon just before dark, mefer ad shelo tachshach, he could end up with a few minutes. Because if you do it at the very end of the day, all you have is that day. And that day might end in a few more minutes. In that case, if it got dark, nightfall came, and he didn't nullify it, well, that's it. He has no opportunity. So that's the one opinion mentioned in the Mishnah. It's that halachic day. Whatever hour it is, it could vary very much in terms of, it could be 5 minutes. We don't know if there's a minimum, but let's say it could be 5 minutes and it could be 23 hours and 55 minutes. To which the Gemara says, Tanya, we're going to bring a braita that has a machloket about this. Hafarat Nedarim kol hayom. You can nullify vows all day. That's what we just saw. But Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, soon because it's two people, they're going to be called the zug, the pair. Amru me'et le'et. They said 24 hours. So now the Gemara wants to know, what's each person's proof? My time in the Tanakama, Amar Kra biyom sham'o. It says on the day. The day sounds like that day, right? If I asked you literally how to understand the pasuk, it sounds like within that day. And then obviously day is just defined as the halachic day. The day starts at night. V'Rabbanan, my time ayu. What's their reason? Dichtiv mi yom el yom. These, by the way, are both in the same pasuk. It says in Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 15, if he's silent from, now what is the yom el yom? Sounds like from today until tomorrow at this time. So they use that as their proof. Okay, and then it says, V'hekimit kol nedarim, right? And then he basically ratifies her vows by being silent for 24 hours. Oh, et kol asara asher aleha, or anything else she forbade on herself. Hakemotam, he established them, ki acharesh la b'yom shamo, because he was silent on the day he heard. So in that one pasuk, we have both things which seem to indicate different things. On the day of sounds like on the day of. Yom al yom sounds like 24 hours. So each one brought their proof, which is very nice, but obviously, what is each one? How does each one understand the other's pasuk? Ulitanakama ha'aktiv mi yom al yom. So they first start with where they left off. The rabbis proved it. I'm sorry. The zug, the pair, proved it from yom al yom. So what does Tanakama do with that? You need it for it. Why? Yom shamo. Now, when you say on the day of could mean only during daylight hours. And there's certain things like you can't have judgments during the nighttime, so maybe you can't nullify during the nighttime. Yom shamo, if you just had on the day you heard, you might have taken day literally and thought only daytime, not nighttime. You would have thought only during the day, not at night. Therefore, to teach you, it's straight, meaning you can even do it through the night. Like, for example, if she took the vow at night, you can nullify it that night all the way until the next day. And that's why it says Yom al Yom. Ulaman da'amar mi Yom al Yom. But according to those who say it's 24 hours, and Yom al Yom is 24 hours, so haktiv b'yom shamo, what do they do with on the day of? You're basically allowing them to nullify it the next day because you're giving her 24 hours, him 24 hours. Itzrich. You need b'yom shamo for something else. De'iktiv mi Yom al Yom hava amina micha b'shaba lecha b'shaba leferla. You might not have thought of this, but what can Yom al Yom be? Yom al Yom could mean I took a vow on a Sunday. My husband has till Yom el Yom, till the next Sunday, till this day next week. Therefore, b'yom shamo comes to say, no, it's only a day. And then a day would be 24 hours, and that we get from Yom, right, we're on, right, exactly. B'yom shamo, it's 24 hours, and b'yom shamo just tells you we're talking about days, 24 hours, and not an entire week. So now, therefore, k'tiv b'yom shamo. Now, we're almost done with our daf. We have two more things to deal with. So the first is, how do we hold? Do we hold like 24-hour pidyon, or do we hold by the that day? Now, knowing that the Mishnah says that day, it makes more sense that that's how we would hold, but not always. But anyway, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and Halacha koto azug. So this is where they call them the zug, the pair. We don't paskin like that pair. Levi, several lemei kahane tanai. Levi wanted to hold like that pair, but Amar le Rav said to him, Hachi Amar Chavivi, my uncle, who is Rabbi Chia, who's the Tosefta is attributed to him. He was the uncle of Rav, and he always called him Chavivi, and halacha koto azug. So we basically have Rav quoting Rabbi Chia, the halacha is not like the zug, and we have Rabbi Shua ben Levi being quoted as we don't paskin like them, and we hold that day, as it says in the Mishnah. Now we have this interesting line to end our daf. Two descriptions of two rabbis who did something. At some point, we don't really know we know what they did. The question is why they do it and what was it relating to? And it's unclear why this is here, but I'll read it in two different ways. He would shoot arrows while he was checking. Checking what? We don't know. Okay, checking vows, it seems. And Rabbi Bar Rav Huna Yativ V'Kayim. He would stand up and sit down, or sit down and stand up while he was checking vows. Now, some people say this is a total non sequitur. It comes up because Shiur bar Rav is the son of Rav. We were just talking about Rav and his uncle. So now we're saying something about his son. Has to do vaguely with our topic because it's talking about Hatarat Nedarim, but Hatarat Nedarim is not Hafarat Nedarim, two different things. Hafarat Nedarim, again, is nullifying the vows of one's wife or one's daughter. And Hatarat Nedarim is when you're a rabbi, a chacham, and people come to you to get rid of their vows, and they sound right. And then there's petach, there's charata, right? There's all different options of how you could do it. You might remember there was a debate about whether charata is enough. Just having regret, is that enough? So some people say that's what these are relating to. These two rabbis, if you would come to them with an issue, and he was shooting his arrows, he would continue to shoot his arrows because charata is very easy, and all you need to do is just say, oh, you feel bad about what you did? And he said, yes, and you move on. So because of that, he would just continue with whatever he was doing. You can imagine, right? He's doing archery here, and the guy comes and he just continues and, oh yeah, no problem. You feel bad? Were you angry? Yeah, okay, move on. And the point is that all you need is charata. And Rabbi Bar Rav Huna would either sit or stand up. It didn't matter. Like normally you sit when you judge because you need to focus. He didn't need focus for the exact same reason. And then again, this really has nothing to do with anything here, but it's here seemingly because it's Rav, Shiur bar Rav is the son of Rav. Okay. The next thing, by the way, also his name is Chia, named, perhaps connected with Rabbi Chia. The other option is that actually what they're talking about is their wives took vows. When their wives would take vows, and then it really has to do with our sugya, the Rush says, they would shoot an arrow or stand up and sit down in order to create a shadow, in order to figure out what time of day it is, so that they would know what 24 hours, when is that going to be? And then it shows that despite that we saw they paskin like the against the oto azug, these rabbis held like oto azug, and that they were trying to, right? I think it's a very creative interpretation, right? It has the obvious advantage that it has everything to do with our sugya. It has a huge ramification because then you see there's this debate. And interesting that Rav quoted his uncle, Rabbi Chia, as saying, no, we don't hold that way. And then Chia, his son, was holding that way. And then you end up with a debate about what the halacha is. And you see that, right? And these rabbis actually acted upon this, right? And then you have this creative way about what does this have to do with anything? Well, it's the idea of creating the shadow and knowing what time it is, which obviously makes sense in a time when people didn't have clocks and, right, relied on other ways of calculating time. With that, we finished today's daf. So again, just a quick review. This was a very simple section where we tried we brought one opinion in the Mishnah, but then the Gemara went into detail to tell us there's a Braita with two different opinions about whether you can be made for Nedarim just that day, or do you have 24 hours? We saw each one's proof text. We saw what each one does with the other. And then we saw some issues about how to paskin. And then we had this last line, which either connects to that or has nothing to do with anything and is just quoted to teach us something else about charata, that you can undo a neder by charata, because not everybody thinks you can. Some people think you need a petach. Obviously, you need a petach. You need to concentrate more and really listen to what the person's telling you and what the situation was to help them come up with a creative petach. With that, we'll finish today's daf. Have a great day, everyone.